Have you ever wondered what true power really looks like? Not the kind that shouts with gunfire or parades with soldiers, but the kind that rules through silence. The kind that makes even the bravest men lower their eyes without a word. This is the story of Victor D'Amato, the man they called the Black Watch. A figure who never needed to sit on the throne because time itself was his throne. He was the shadow behind every deal, the silence behind every fear, the legend who turned whispers into law. In this video, you will uncover the chilling origins of a boy who learned to command without speaking. The rise of an empire built not on violence, but on inevitability. The night when the world's most ruthless bosses faced him and lost. And finally, the legacy that outlived them all. Because you can kill a man, but you can't kill silence. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll understand why some clocks don't just tell time, they decide it. Some stories are shouted into the world with the roar of gunfire, with bloody street battles that paint entire blocks in fear, with desperate men screaming their names to carve out a place in history. Those stories are loud, chaotic, unforgettable. But then there are other stories. Stories no one dares to speak of openly. Stories whispered in the shadows, exchanged with nervous glances, sealed with silence. These stories are not written in blood, but in fear. And when you stumble upon them, you realize they weigh heavier than any bullet, cut deeper than any knife. For years, people have spoken of the great bosses men who rose to power in plain sight, who claimed their thrones through brutality and boldness. Yet behind every upheaval, behind every shifting alliance, there has always been a darker shadow, unseen but ever present, a force that never needed to announce itself, yet could erase anyone at any time. His name is Victor D'Amato, but you will rarely, if ever, hear someone say it out loud. In the underworld, he is known only by a name that chills even the bravest, the Black Watch. Not because he flaunts wealth with expensive timepieces, not because he collects rare clocks, but because when the hands of the clock strike a certain hour, someone, somewhere, disappears. No gunshots, no blood, no evidence, just silence. And sometimes, a single black watch left behind, its hands frozen at the exact moment the victim vanished. What terrifies men most about Victor is not violence, it's the absence of it. He has no need to raise his voice, no need to pound his fist on the table. One glance from him is enough to silence an entire room. One tap of his finger against the polished wood of a desk is enough to make hardened killers sweat. His power is not in the chaos of rage, but in the precision of control. Absolute, unquestionable, suffocating control. Legends about him travel like smoke through the back alleys of Naples, through the ports of Marseille, across the bars of Brooklyn. One such story is still whispered with dread. A rival once mocked him openly, sneering at the nickname Black Watch, calling it a cheap attempt to inspire fear. That very night, as the clock struck 12, the man vanished without a trace. His dinner table was still set. His glass of wine still bore the mark of his lips. The police found no struggle, no body, no suspect. Only a single watch lying on the chair, its hands locked at midnight. From that moment on, nobody laughed at the name again. And so Victor became something more than a man. He became a reminder, a warning, a countdown. To some, he was the shadow of death, patient but inevitable. To others, he was the church bell that tolled for the damned. But for everyone who ever crossed him, he was the one word that couldn't be escaped: fear. What sets Victor apart from the other bosses is not his brutality. It's his elegance. Where others demanded attention, Victor commanded silence. Where others spilled blood to prove their strength, Victor shifted the entire game without moving a muscle. He was the architect of unseen wars, the composer of chaos that others mistook for chance. The truth, every move they thought was theirs, was his design all along. And yet, the greatest mystery remains. Who is Victor D'Amato really? Some say he was once the right hand of a fallen Italian Don, surviving the collapse only to build his own empire in the shadows. Others whisper that he was educated, military-trained, a ghost from governments who now uses their secrets against them. The truth? No one knows. No one dares to. But this is what they do know. Wherever Victor's shadow falls, power bends. Kings bow. Bosses retreat. Because Victor never fought for the throne. He never cared for titles. He doesn't need to. While others fight to sit on the highest chair, he sits in the back of the room, silent, watching, waiting, like a clock that never stops ticking. That is the true horror of Victor D'Amato. Not the things he has done, but the things he hasn't yet needed to do. And that is why you are here, listening to this story. Because if you truly want to understand how the underworld works, if you want to understand why even the boldest men eventually fall silent, you must begin with the man they fear most, the man they do not name, Victor D'Amato, the Black Watch. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more you'll realize. Sometimes the deadliest move is not the one made, but the one that has been waiting all along. Every legend begins somewhere. Even the most terrifying shadows were once men who walked in the light. The question with Victor D'Amato was never if he had a beginning. It was where and how. The truth is scattered, hidden behind conflicting stories and fragments of rumor. But one thread runs through them all. Victor never stumbled into power. He was shaped for it, piece by piece, year by year, until silence itself obeyed him. Victor's earliest years are a puzzle few dare to reconstruct. Some say he was born in Naples, the child of a dock worker who fell into debt with the wrong people. Others claim he was born in Palermo, where whispers suggest his mother worked in the kitchen of a powerful Mafia family. But wherever it began, one fact was certain. His childhood was surrounded by whispers, debts, and the constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. As a boy, Victor was unnervingly observant. While other children played in the streets, he lingered in corners, watching men argue, memorizing every gesture, every pause, every weakness. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His silence unsettled people. Even then, when asked a question, he would often respond with nothing more than a look that forced others to keep talking, to reveal more than they intended. There is an old tale, perhaps true, perhaps exaggerated, of a young Victor sitting in a dimly lit cafe, watching his father beg for more time to pay back a loan. The man across the table was an enforcer, known for breaking bones without hesitation. But instead of striking, the enforcer froze when Victor, no more than 12, tapped the edge of the table in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was quiet, but relentless. The man grew uneasy, as though the boy had already sentenced him to something inevitable. That night, the enforcer left without violence, and Victor's father lived another month. People began to whisper that the boy had the timing of death. By his late teens, Victor had slipped between worlds. He was too intelligent for the streets, yet too ruthless for a normal life. He studied quietly, some say in law, others in military tactics. There are rumors that he even attended a Jesuit school for a brief time, where he learned discipline and the art of patience. Whatever the truth, Victor absorbed knowledge the way others breathed air. But alongside learning, he earned scars. He ran errands for smugglers at the docks. He carried coded messages for men whose names no one dared record. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people leaned in. There was weight in his words, as if each syllable carried the pressure of a verdict. By the time he was 20, Victor had no official title, no recognized power. Yet people already referred to him as the boy who makes silence heavy. Those who crossed him ended up unsettled, or worse, erased in ways no one could explain. He was not yet the Black Watch, but the foundations were being laid. Every empire is born in blood, but Victor's was born in time. The story goes like this. A powerful mid-level boss in Naples once underestimated him. This boss saw Victor as nothing more than an errand boy and demanded he deliver a message to rival smugglers. Victor refused, calmly. Without raising his voice, he told the boss that sending that message would start a war the man could not win. The boss laughed. He sent the message anyway. 3 nights later, the boss's entire crew vanished. Not killed, vanished. Their homes empty, their families untouched, their weapons left behind. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist. In the center of the boss's office sat a single pocket watch, its hands frozen at the hour he had mocked Victor. The man himself was never seen again. From that moment on, the underworld stopped treating Victor as an errand boy. He was no longer a ghost at the edge of the table. He was the table. The nickname began quietly, almost as a joke. But jokes in the underworld have a way of becoming truths. "Beware the Black Watch," they said. At first it was a warning told over drinks. Then it became a whispered prayer from those about to betray him. Soon it was no longer a name, but a symbol. Victor embraced it, not with pride, but with calculation. He began using watches cheap, ordinary, but marked in a single way. Their hands always frozen at the moment his will was carried out. It was his signature, his message. He never needed to spill blood in public. The watch spoke for him. The deeper he went, the less anyone understood who he truly was. Was he Mafia? Was he something older, darker, beyond criminal codes? By the time people asked the question, it was already too late. Victor's rise was not meteoric. It was steady, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. He never rushed, never stumbled. Each move was placed with precision, each ally chosen with care, each rival erased not by chaos, but by inevitability. By the time he reached his 30s, there was no single family, no cartel, no syndicate that could claim dominance without brushing against his shadow. And each time they did, they found the same outcome: silence, and the steady hands of a black watch marking their final moment. It was not just fear he commanded. It was inevitability. To live under Victor's shadow was to live on borrowed time. And so the boy who once sat in corners, listening, became the man the entire underworld could not stop watching. Not because he was loud, not because he was violent, but because he taught them all one undeniable truth. Time always runs out, and Victor D'Amato is the one who decides when. Power comes in many forms. Some men measure it in stacks of money, in fleets of cars, in the number of soldiers at their command. But Victor D'Amato measured it in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that settles when fear has already decided the outcome. By the time Victor was in his mid-30s, his influence no longer resembled the empire of a typical crime boss. There were no flamboyant displays of wealth, no reckless parades of bodyguards, no gaudy villas to show off his dominance. Instead, his power was invisible, like a current moving beneath the surface of the sea. Those who underestimated it often drowned before they even realized the tide had shifted. Victor's empire wasn't built on bullets. It was built on networks. Dock workers, lawyers, bankers, waiters, priests, people from every walk of life owed him something, or feared him enough to comply without question. None of them were soldiers in the traditional sense, but each of them was a piece on his board. If you were in debt, Victor knew. If your marriage was failing, Victor knew. If you cheated on your taxes, stole from your partner, or whispered secrets you thought were safe, Victor knew. And knowledge, in his hands, was sharper than any knife. He never shouted his commands. A message passed through 3 intermediaries, a note left in a ledger, a subtle nod in a crowded bar. His orders traveled like smoke, reaching those who needed to hear them without ever being traced back to him. And yet, everything moved with precision. To live under Victor's shadow was to feel watched, not by him directly, but by the world itself. You never knew who among your neighbors, your colleagues, even your family might be carrying his instructions. In Victor's empire, silence wasn't just a tool, it was law. His people were not bound by contracts or codes written in ink. They were bound by something stronger: fear of breaking the silence. A dock worker who saw too much learned to keep his mouth shut because he knew the clock was always ticking. A lawyer who found irregularities in a case knew better than to ask questions. A banker who handled unusual transfers never spoke a word, even to his wife. And when someone did break the silence, they simply disappeared. No screaming, no warnings, just absence. And in their place, perhaps a watch its hands, frozen at the hour of their mistake. It was not violence that enforced Victor's rule, but the anticipation of violence. The idea that he could strike at any time, anywhere, without warning. That idea alone was enough to keep thousands in line. The reach of Victor's empire was astonishing. In Naples, the ports moved at his schedule. In Palermo, the courts tilted mysteriously toward those he favored. In Marseille, shipments disappeared or arrived exactly when he wanted. In New York, men in suits whispered his name as though it might summon him. Entire cities bent to him without realizing they had bowed. Politicians made deals they couldn't remember agreeing to. Police chiefs turned blind eyes without knowing why. Judges signed papers with trembling hands. And through it all, Victor never appeared. He didn't need to. When rival families or cartels tried to expand into his territory, they found obstacles everywhere. Trucks stalled, papers went missing, banks froze accounts, friends turned cold. And then, as if to remind them whose shadow they were trespassing into, one of their men would vanish, leaving only a watch behind. The message was always the same: you are on borrowed time. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Victor's empire was how many of his so-called allies had never even met him. They carried out his will without seeing his eyes, without hearing his voice. They obeyed not because they knew him, but because they knew of him. A rumor here, a story there, a whispered warning in the middle of the night. The legend of the Black Watch was more powerful than the man himself. And yet, for those rare few who did stand in his presence, the experience was unforgettable. They described him not as a raging tyrant, but as a calm inevitability. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that felt like confessions. and when he finally gave an instruction, it was always terrifyingly simple. One man recalled the moment Victor leaned forward, tapped a watch on the table, and said, "Do nothing." The man obeyed. Weeks later, when his rivals imploded under their own weight, he realized the order had been a masterstroke. Victor did not fight wars. He let time fight them for him. The greatest empires in history fell because of pride, because of greed, because of overreach. But Victor's empire had no flags, no armies, no monuments. It existed only in the space between people's fears. And how do you conquer something that exists only in the mind? That was his brilliance. He did not just control men's actions, he controlled their imaginations. The fear of what he might do was far more powerful than anything he ever actually did. A silence heavier than thunder. By the time Victor reached his 40s, the Black Watch was no longer just a name. It was a system, an empire without borders, a kingdom built not on land or money, but on inevitability. And as the underworld whispered his name with trembling lips, one truth became clear. Victor D'Amato did not rule with violence, wealth, or even charisma. He ruled with time itself. For years, Victor D'Amato had been nothing more than a shadow in the stories of others. A name that traveled like smoke through whispers, a presence that lingered even in empty rooms. Few had seen him. Fewer still had spoken to him. And yet his absence was louder than the presence of any rival dawn. But shadows do not remain unseen forever. Eventually, even the most patient predator must step into the open. The day came when the rival families, tired of losing men, losing shipments, losing ground, decided they had nothing left to fear. They gathered in Rome, in an old villa on the outskirts of the city. It was a place chosen for its secrecy, its fortified walls, its reputation as neutral ground. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke, ambition, and the arrogance of men who believed that if they stood together, they could finally break the spell of silence that bound them. Around the long mahogany table sat men whose names once commanded respect. Carlo Benedetti, a ruthless Neapolitan boss. Miguel Santos, a Spaniard with a taste for chaos. Anton Volkov, a Russian with enough firepower to topple small governments. And there were others, capos, underbosses, emissaries, all gathered under the fragile illusion of unity. For hours they argued about territory, money, and revenge. Victor's name was spat like venom, dismissed as a myth, cursed as a ghost that had gone too far. They shouted, pounded fists, made promises of blood. The room was a storm of noise. Then, without announcement, the storm ended. A door at the far end of the villa opened, slowly, deliberately. The man who entered was not escorted by bodyguards. He was not armed, nor dressed in flamboyant wealth. He wore a black suit, plain, almost forgettable, save for the aura that preceded him. His hair was silver at the edges, his eyes calm, steady, unyielding. He walked as though the ground itself bent to him, each step measured like the ticking of a clock. The room fell silent before anyone realized why. Victor D'Amato had arrived. No one expected him to come. No one believed he would ever appear in person. And yet, there he stood, unhurried, unafraid, facing the very men who had sworn to destroy him. He did not sit at the head of the table. He did not even take the central chair. Instead, he placed a small black watch on the polished wood, its hands frozen at midnight. Then he pulled out an empty chair at the far end, as though to remind them, he never needed the throne to rule. "Continue," he said quietly. His voice was low, calm, yet it carried through the villa as though the walls themselves leaned closer to hear him. But no one spoke. The men who had been screaming minutes before now avoided his gaze. Carlo Benedetti, who had once sworn to burn Victor's network to the ground, found himself staring at the floor. Miguel Santos shifted in his seat, wiping sweat from his palms. Anton Volkov, the Russian, clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles went white. It was not what Victor had said. It was the unbearable weight of his silence. Finally, one of them broke. "You think you can walk in here alone, without protection?" Benedetti forced a laugh that rang hollow. "Do you think your shadow still scares us? Look around, D'Amato. You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're finished." Victor tilted his head slightly, as though studying a child who had spoken out of turn. Then he reached out, tapped the frozen watch once, and replied, "No, Carlo. You are finished." The words were soft, almost gentle. But in that instant, every man in the room felt it. The inevitability, the quiet certainty that time itself had just run out for Carlo Benedetti. Benedetti's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. For the first time in decades, the ruthless Neapolitan boss was speechless. Victor leaned back in his chair. He did not raise his voice, did not make threats. Instead, he said only this: "You have mistaken noise for power. You have mistaken numbers for control. But the clock doesn't care how loud you shout or how many stand beside you. The clock only moves forward. And when it stops, so do you." The meeting did not end in gunfire. There was no bloodbath, no cinematic showdown. Instead, it ended the way all of Victor's encounters did, in silence. One by one, the men around the table lowered their eyes. They did not pledge loyalty, but they did not resist. They did not sign contracts, but they understood. The Black Watch had given them a choice without words: obey the silence or be consumed by it. Within a week, Benedetti's crew dissolved. Santos vanished from Madrid. Volkov retreated to Moscow, never again daring to cross into Victor's territories. The villa itself was abandoned, its walls left to crumble, as though even stone could not bear the memory of that night. And through it all, Victor D'Amato returned to his shadows, as though nothing had happened. He had not fired a shot. He had not raised a hand. He had not needed to. Those who were there still struggled to explain it. Some said Victor's calmness was more terrifying than any gun. Others swore the ticking of an unseen clock filled the room, though no clock was present. All agreed on one thing. The confrontation had not been a battle. It had been a verdict. Victor had shown them all what they had secretly known for years: that their empires were fragile, built on sand, and that time was the only true ruler. And time, in the hands of the Black Watch, was unforgiving. From that day on, no one questioned whether Victor D'Amato was real. He was no longer a ghost story. He was flesh, blood, and inevitability. And yet, his greatest power remained not what he did in that room, but what he chose not to do. Because when a man like Victor spares you, the silence that follows is more terrifying than death itself. Time is the one thing no man escapes. For most, it is a chain pulling them toward decline, toward age, toward death. But for Victor D'Amato, the Black Watch time was never a chain. It was a weapon, a shield, and ultimately, the essence of his legacy. After the confrontation in Rome, the underworld changed forever. Men who once thrived on chaos now counted their hours carefully. Families who measured strength in numbers now measured it in silence. Even those who had never seen Victor, who only heard the whispers of his name, began living as if every clock on every wall belonged to him. The Black Watch was no longer just a man. He was an idea, and ideas do not die. Years after that night in the villa, new bosses rose, eager to carve their empires. They spoke loudly, brandished their power, declared themselves untouchable. But always, beneath their bravado, there was a question they dared not voice. What if Victor is still watching? When deals were struck, someone would glance at a watch on their wrist, uneasy at the ticking. When enemies threatened war, someone would whisper, "Wait, what if he's behind this?" Even silence itself began to feel like his hand, pressing down gently but firmly, reminding everyone that noise had a cost. In cities he had touched: Naples, Palermo, Marseille, New York. The very rhythm of life seemed slower, more cautious. Men lowered their voices. Women warned their husbands to choose words carefully. Politicians paused before signing documents, as though listening for a ticking clock only they could hear. Victor had created something more durable than fear of death. He had created the fear of inevitability. As with all figures larger than life, stories about Victor grew stranger with each telling. Some claimed he had never aged, that he looked the same at 60 as he did at 30. Others swore he could vanish from locked rooms, appearing elsewhere at the exact moment the clock struck midnight. A few went further, whispering that he was not a man at all, but a spirit born from centuries of silence, wearing the mask of humanity. Of course, these were lies, or at least they should have been. Yet the underworld thrives on lies, especially those that frighten more effectively than truth. Victor never corrected them. He never needed to. The myth was his greatest ally. And so, while other dons and capos spent fortunes on guns, soldiers, and campaigns, Victor's empire lived on without expense. His greatest investment was rumor, and rumor multiplied without limit. One of the strangest stories told of Victor's final years was the rumor of the clock without hands. Supposedly, he carried it everywhere in his later life. A simple pocket watch, polished but incomplete, its face empty, its hands removed. When asked why, he was said to smile faintly and reply, "Because time belongs to me now." Whether this story was truth or invention, it spread like wildfire. And in spreading, it reinforced the image of Victor, not as a man bound by time, but as one who had mastered it. Every ticking watch, every clock tower toll, became a reminder of his invisible dominion. And then, one day, he was gone. There were no witnesses, no funeral, no body. One week he was seen at a quiet cafe in Naples, sipping espresso, nodding politely to the waiter. The next week, nothing. His home was empty, his network leaderless, his presence erased, as if he had dissolved into the silence he had always commanded. Some said he fled, vanishing into South America, with a fortune no one could trace. Others believed he had been killed, his death hidden by those too afraid to admit it. But the most enduring belief was simpler. Victor hadn't died. He had merely stepped outside of time, leaving the rest of the world to keep counting. And so his disappearance only deepened the myth. Because how do you kill silence? How do you bury inevitability? Decades later, his name is still spoken. Quietly, carefully. Young gangsters who never lived under his rule still shiver when they hear the Black Watch. They imitate his tactics, trying to build empires of silence, but none succeed. They mistake patience for weakness, quiet for absence. They forget that Victor's silence was not emptiness. It was control. His legacy is not in the territory he held, the money he moved, or the lives he ended. It is in the way he reshaped the underworld itself. He taught them that noise was weakness, that fear could be louder than violence, and that time was the only true authority. And long after his body disappeared, the underworld still ticks to the rhythm he set. So who was Victor D'Amato? Was he a man, brilliant and ruthless, who mastered the art of silence? Or was he something greater, a legend born to remind the world that power is not in shouting, but in waiting? No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. But tonight, as you glance at the clock on your wall, as you listen to its steady ticking in the dark, ask yourself, what if the Black Watch is still out there, waiting for the moment the hands stop? And when that moment comes, when time runs out, will you be ready? And so, the legend of Victor D'Amato, the Black Watch, remains. Some say he vanished into history. Others believe he still walks among us, waiting for the right moment when time runs out. But here's the truth. His story isn't just about fear, or power, or silence. It's about us, about how easily we mistake noise for strength, and how often we ignore the quiet forces that shape our lives. Perhaps his silence was a warning. Perhaps it was a mirror, showing us that the choices we make, every word, every betrayal, every moment wasted, are all being measured by a clock we cannot control. So tonight, as you hear the ticking of your own clock, ask yourself, what are you doing with the time you have left? If this story made your heart race, if it left you with questions, or even if it left you a little unsettled, that means the Black Watch has done his work. Now it's your turn. Share this story. Comment what you believe about Victor's fate. Do you think he was just a man, or something more? And don't forget to subscribe, because the shadows still hold many stories waiting to be told. Because time never stops, and neither do the stories.